Hello friends, my name is Marines, and today I'm going to be talking about the worst books that I read last year. Now these are books that I read in 2019, not that were necessarily published in that year, and just in case it wasn't clear from the title and that introduction, I'm going to be extra salty about these books. There are 7 books on this list, and I'm going to start with one that's in a league of its own because I knew going into this book that I was going to hate it. That is After by Todd. It's also a weird entry on this list because I have been reading this book for 3 years. In case you're new around here or you haven't heard me talk about it yet, I own a website called snarksquad.com, and we do recaps for TV shows and books primarily. We also have 2 podcasts, things of that nature. It's an entertainment website. We were recapping books right at the beginning of Snark Squad. We started with books that we read as children, so things like Sweet Valley High, Babysitter's Club, Nancy Drew, just kind of taking a snarky adult look at the things we were reading as we were kids. And then on a whim, I picked up 50 Shades of Grey like right when the hype was building, and I was reading it and I was like, what the heck is this crap? So I decided, wouldn't it be fun to recap my way through that book? And I did. And after we finished the entire 50 Shades of Grey series, including one of the books told from Grey's perspective, we moved on to Twilight and we did all 4 of those books, and then we moved on to After, and we finished that project recapping almost 100 chapters entry by entry this year. I already have a video up on this channel that talks about the most pernicious aspect of After, and that is how it romanticizes abuse. I have thousands of words dedicated to more fully and eloquently explaining why this is a dumpster fire, but I didn't want to leave it completely off this list because any year in which I read any amount of words written by Todd, they are most definitely the worst words I've read. The rest of the books on this list are books that I went into in good faith, believing that I would enjoy the books, and not that, you know, everybody enjoys everything that they read, but After was different. I knew I was not going to like that book. I had a very specific project in mind. That's why I picked it up. With the rest of these, I was just going about my reading way when I encountered they're awful. I have ranked these from my least hated, like the least worst to the most worst. Just so we're clear, they're all pretty bad. Number 7 on this list is The 10,000 Doors of January by Alix E. Harrow. This is a YA fantasy / historical fiction in which a young girl named January Scholar is the ward of this mysterious rich man, and she lives with him while her father travels the globe collecting treasure for this rich man. She ends up finding a book that has a story about a woman and a man who separately find doors, portals into other worlds, other places, and their paths cross, and then kind of how their story develops together. And as she's reading about their story, she's also discovering that her connection to the story is bigger than she imagined. This might be the biggest shame on my list because it truly had so many elements that should have been right up my alley. This had a story within a story, which I love. This was a portal fantasy, which I love. This had flowery writing, which I love. My biggest issue here is that I thought that we were getting like a slowly building story, something that was layered and complex. So I didn't mind that sort of slow build because I thought we were getting somewhere. And at first it kind of felt like maybe that was true, that the pieces would all click into place in a very satisfying way, and that did indeed happen. It did click into place in that way, but then soon after we just kind of sat around again and talked a lot. So the unevenness of the action really left something to be desired, and I really do think it was the unevenness. Had it just been a quiet story with a consistently slow pace, or had it been an action-packed story, or had it measured those things better and kind of like ebbed and flowed in a more graceful way, all of those things would have been okay. But really what it was that you would be slow and quiet, and then it would just like zoom away in this action and then slam on the brakes. It often felt like the action was landing like a bowling ball in the middle of the story. My other big issue with the story was how the author presented some of the colonialism and racism. Our main character is biracial, and so she has to deal with a lot of that racism, and my issue is that it's never presented as okay necessarily. It's not countered in a way that I thought was satisfying. I thought it could have used with a little bit more of like, I know this isn't true, but, and we don't get enough of that. So it just created an uncomfortable reading experience for me personally, to constantly have to read these racist things and to read January's internalized racism. I thought that that was the biggest thing that was like a super bummer. It made a mediocre reading experience worse, and bad enough that it landed in my least favorites of the year. Number 6 is Slayer by Kiersten White. This is also a YA fantasy that is set in the Buffyverse. Explaining the plot of this is tricky because there are 7 seasons of a TV show that come before it, plus a number of graphic novels that I have actually never read. In the simplest terms, this follows a girl named Mina who is the daughter of 2 Watchers. She grows up with a lot of anti-Slayer sentiment, but surprise, she is one of the last Slayers to be activated because the source of all magic has been destroyed, so no more Slayers are being activated, and she was the last one. From there are a few other like plots and threads of like bad magical things happening, but you know, that's fine. That's enough plot. So I ended up not liking this on 2 different fronts. First is as a self-contained story. It used a lot of devices that I personally don't like. For instance, it over-relied on a dense main character. For this story to work, we had to have somebody at the helm that was like literally not noticing anything and that was jumping to conclusions, and just, she was just so stupid. It just, if one person would have used their words or would have clarified a situation, if one person had said, wait, no, that's not really how that happened, and like elaborated, the entire plot would have fallen apart. I hate stories that feel that way. The writing was also very repetitive and just in general a little simplistic. On top of that, I didn't like it as kind of a entry into the larger Buffyverse. I didn't truly understand who this story was for. It had a lot of like explanation and backstory loaded right up at the front, so you thought that maybe this was for somebody who wasn't well aware of the Buffyverse, but then it had all of these self-referential things and jokes and moments. It went out of its way to really make these jokes and references, so it was for somebody who is familiar with the Buffyverse. But then as somebody who is familiar with the Buffyverse, I'm reading this and there was so much Buffy hate as the character, which I completely did not understand. And not only did I not understand, I actively disliked it because I love Buffy, and the reason that I love Buffy the Vampire Slayer is because I love Buffy as a character. And we spent all of this time learning about like the institution of a Slayer and why the Watchers and the Watchers Council, like they were a stand-in for misogyny in the story. So then to flip here and get a story from a perspective that is like basically defending the misogyny of the story was just like a really interesting choice, especially because you spend so much time doing that, even though the story doesn't really want you to believe that, because the main character Nina's going to have a change of heart. But then why did we just spend all this time doing this? We did a full episode on this book over on Snark Squad Pod. Sam from Thoughts on Tomes was our guest for that episode, so if you want to hear all of our thoughts on why this was bad and also questioning who this was for, you can check out that episode. Number 5 is The Hazelwood by Melissa Albert. This is also a YA fantasy in which a girl named Alice is basically, she spends her life on the run with her mother, trying to outrun their bad luck. Alice's grandmother is an author. She wrote this collection of fairy tale stories that has like a cult following, and then when her grandmother dies, Alice's mother is kidnapped, and all that's left behind is a letter basically telling Alice not to go to her grandmother's estate, the Hazelwood. Alice does not. She pairs up with this kid who is basically a super fan of Alice's grandmother and of the fairy tale stories, and they basically have to journey to the Hazelwood, and then they also find out that the stories that her grandmother wrote about were probably not entirely fiction. The plot synopsis that I just gave is the information basically on the back of the book. So my first complaint is the amount of time that you get doing that back of the book thing before anything else happens. Like, you spend all of this time traveling to the Hazelwood. Traveling is a strong word too, because like they don't have any direction. They really don't know where they're going. They're just being dragged along by the plot. Like the entire thing is like fate will take them. So it's very passive, and you spend this amount of time being super passive and then getting to the place where it's like, and this place that she wrote about might not be fiction, and it felt like a turning point for the story, but like I knew we were going there because of the back of the book told me. It was just weird the way that it like cleaved the story in two. And then the second half, once you get to the Hazelwood and you're like, ooh, fantasy world, it felt like an entirely different story than the first half of the book. The explanations for the magic and the fantasy elements were weird. I'm not the type of person that needs like intricate magic systems or explanations when my magic exists. Like, that's cool, I like that, but I also don't care when it's like just because magic, like fluffy magic. Here, the existence of that is weird because you do have like a real world element, so then just sprinkling some just because magic on top felt weird. But then the story does explain things, but just so late in the game that at that point, like, I didn't care anymore. It didn't make sense to introduce explanations when it did. Like, there were things like our main character is like rude. I did not like her. She's so crotchety. But then like way late in the game, it's like, this is why. And I was like, I don't care. I don't care anymore. I've spent so much time with this rude main character. Like, I don't care what you have to say about why she is the way she is. The last part of the book, when you're basically in a different story, not only does like the action just super ramp up and you're in a different place, but also just started introducing additional characters. And it's like, am I supposed to care about this like new cast of characters you've introduced in the last section of your book? And I think that I was supposed to, but I didn't. Again, the story just felt like cleaved in two, and neither part was particularly good. Number 4 is The Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. This is an adult fantasy in which a witch named Diana unwittingly uses her magic to obtain an alchemical manuscript that contains the secrets of the various creatures that exist in this world. She is then targeted by these creatures because they think that she has this book still. She then forms an unlikely alliance with a vampire who decides to protect her and marry her, I guess. I was very into the beginning of this book because I was digging the setting at Oxford. It felt very rich and atmospheric, and it just felt well researched. I was also into the idea of Diana as a character. She's a scholar and she's smart and applied, and the story tells us that she's really good at research, she's really good at her job, and she's just not interested in being a witch. Everything devolves from there because this book does all of that great setup work to then abandon it and focus on the relationship between Matthew and Diana. It turns into a very generic story about an alpha male, and the woman who we are told over and over again is a strong woman who lacks any kind of backbone because she lets the alpha male do whatever he wants and make all of her decisions. We ignore the urgency of the plot completely for all of these like nonsense breaks to do things like vampire yoga. Every time I mention this book, I have to mention vampire yoga because I'm literally so salty. In another book, it could have been a really cool detail, but because it just set up this like these huge stakes in this big world and this thing that we're told is like life or death, and then it's like, no, we're gonna spend a chapter doing vampire yoga. Salty. Even if this book had built up this premise to only abandon it and focus on the romance, I could have been okay with that if I liked the romance at all. Matthew is the worst, and I don't understand why Diana likes him at all. And then Diana is just shown as being like hapless and helpless, and truly one of like her like abilities that everybody's like, oh my god, you can do that, is that she and Matthew break up for like a hot second and she cries so much that she almost drowns herself with her magical tears. She has all of this innate ability, but again, the story just kind of craps on her by making her have absolutely no control over like her witch tears and her witch wind or whatever else she has. Just is so annoying. Number 3 is actually 2 books at the same time, and they are A Study in Charlotte and The Last of August by Brittany Cavallaro. I was trying in 2019 to finish off some series that I have hanging open. I'm the worst at finishing series, and I had read A Study in Charlotte a couple years before and never continued on with the series. I thought it was fine. It was a solid YA mystery, but then I reread it in order to continue with the series, and I was like, this isn't as good as I remember. Actually, I think I don't like it. And then I read The Last of August and I hated it. In the first book, the mystery is at least readable, but the thing that I disliked was the entire relationship between Charlotte and Jamie, which are the counterparts for Holmes and Watson. The entire concept of these two people being up at the same school, even though they later explain it, like it just kind of stretches your willingness to believe that things develop in this way. But then it ham-fists the relationship between these two characters to a point where like that already stretch willingness to believe the concept and to invest just pulled it to a place where I was like, it is not going to be sustainable. Jamie is the worst, and particularly for the way that he is so possessive of Charlotte. Immediately, the way that he jumps into the relationship and has that possessiveness and kind of that claim over Charlotte and her time and her person, it just was really, really gross to me. But I know that there are a lot of people who really love the series on BookTube, so even after I reread the first one and the mystery was at least readable, but the relationship was meh, I was like, well, maybe it gets better because people ship these two together, so maybe the progression of their relationship is what is really key. So I read The Last of August, and as I already mentioned, I super freaking hated it. Jamie's pettiness and his possessiveness and his jealousy is like on full display in the second book. I don't understand if these two characters even like each other or what their redeeming qualities are supposed to be. Charlotte is so dismissive and condescending, and it's under this thin guise of being like the detective genius. The entire book is one giant relationship fight, and they just get into the same fight over and over and over and over again. Part of what they're fighting about is that Charlotte has PTSD after being sexually assaulted, and she doesn't like physical touch, but Jamie's in love with her and he really wants to touch her. So they're having this fight over and over again, and I honestly like sat back and was like, am I supposed to like Jamie as a person? Because he keeps insisting that he wants to touch his quasi girlfriend even though she has PTSD. Is this romantic? I don't understand. The story didn't give enough weight to Charlotte's healing and her reasoning and what she was going through, because we're getting it from Jamie's perspective. So all we're getting from his perspective is, but I want to touch her. The mystery in the second book is absolutely trash. It's just so convoluted, and you know, the thing with mystery is as you get more pieces, it's supposed to be like satisfying, but the more and more we found out about the mystery, like the more upset I was getting. Number 2 is Watchmen by Alan Moore. We decided to cover this on Snark Squad Pod because in 2019 HBO released an adaptation of Watchmen. It's not the same characters, it is a continuation or like set in the same kind of world. I have not watched that, even though I have heard amazing things about it, because after I read Watchmen, I was just so sour on the entire thing that I never like got over it enough to watch the new thing. I will, just because after it kind of finished, multiple people have told me, no, Mari, you need to watch the adaptation, but I'm not ready yet. This is a graphic novel that is set in an alternate 1980 in which we won the Vietnam War and Nixon is still president, and also heroes exist. So for a while, heroes were above ground. I guess they were doing the vigilante justice thing, but things started to get out of control, and so there was legislation that was put in place that basically outlawed superheroes. When we join the story, somebody is targeting these ex-heroes, somebody is killing them, and one man, Rorschach, who never really went underground, he's still doing his vigilante thing, is investigating and trying to warn the other ex-heroes that this murderer is on the loose. This is definitely one of those books that got worse and worse in my feelings. If you listen to the episode, the Snark Squad Pod episode, I'm more middle of the way about it. Like, I'm more willing to give it its due because of when it was released and what it did for the genre, what it did for superhero stories, and just sort of the things in the format that worked well. However, the more that I thought about it, the more those things kind of faded into the background, and just the story, the like sour parts of the story is really what is standing out in my head. In this super grim story, I feel like I didn't have a single entry point. People were dying and something about a murderer, but I didn't care because I didn't care about any of the characters. None of them were good, and I guess that's okay. Like, you don't have to have a good character in your story per se, but the thing was that any of them could have been murdered and it would have been all of the same to me. There wasn't even an emotional connection with a bad character. There was nothing. There was absolutely no way for me to get invested with any of these characters. And that would have been like, okay, again, like just kind of middle of the road, if it also weren't really, really bad to come to in 2019 with like a more modern mindset and a better understanding, I guess, of media and misogyny, because basically the whole thing is that this story is absolutely trash to all of its women. It's a super classic example of a man trying to imagine the very worst timeline and going, I know, they rape women here. And ultimately, one of those women who does get raped has this huge speech justifying the rapist to us as the reader. It's like a, it wasn't that bad kind of speech. I understand the ways in which this was formative for a time and for a genre, but boy howdy, does it not stand the test of time. And number one, surprising no one, is Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. I feel bad because I read this in December, which means that I did a standalone review and I talked about it in my December wrap up, and now it's here on this list. And so it's been like very, like, I'm going to get over it. I'm going to stop talking about it. But because I read my worst book of the year in December, it's just been kind of nonstop for you guys. I know that. It's also possible that this tops my list because I read it most recently, and so the hate is fresh. I thought about that and I tried to be like objective with myself, but with all of these other things, there were things that at the time of reading that I could look back on and say, like, here were some highlights. With the 10,000 Doors of January, it was the very flowery, beautiful writing. With Slayer, it was some of the side characters, some of the humor, and some of the references. With the Hazelwood, it was some of the commentary on fandoms and the way that we attach to a work. With The Discovery of Witches, it was the introduction and the very atmospheric setting. With A Study in Charlotte, at least, it was the readability of the mystery. And in Watchmen, it was the format and the way that they used a graphic novel, some of the transitions from frame to frame. When I finished Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, I had not one positive thing to say about it. This is an adult fantasy in which this woman is basically recruited to Yale to work for the policing secret society, the one that looks over the rest of the secret society, but it's all like dark and spooky because they're involved in magic. I didn't enjoy the writing here. I know that some people enjoyed Bardugo's like descriptive writing, but I personally did not. I found that it was descriptive in a way that really didn't add much to the story. It was like one of those like list descriptions, like I knew every brick and building, everybody who was in the quad, what kind of pea coat they were wearing, and she always described people's faces as moons. I don't know why, like that happened a lot. So it's just like this description that felt like it was weighing down the story instead of adding something to it. I also know that people liked the dark atmosphere, the sort of like grimness of the story, but I did not enjoy that either. I felt like a lot of things that she added to be grim and to be graphic were gratuitous. In a lot of ways, I felt like I couldn't escape just sort of the presence of Leigh Bardugo as the author of this story. Even with like the descriptions, it very much felt pretentious from this way that she wasn't trying to necessarily build or recreate a world for us. It felt more like she was trying to show us all of the things that she knew about Yale. In the same way, all of that like graphic spectacle, violence just felt very like pushed in my face in this way that it was like, it's dark, see? I've written an adult book. It didn't feel very graceful at all. In general, this just felt very overwritten. I didn't like any of the characters. I thought that the messages were very confused. I didn't enjoy the plot, and it was uncomfortable and unenjoyable to read in general. I will take away nothing positive from this book. I would never read it again. I would never recommend it, and truly, I will one day stop talking about this book, but for now, it was the worst book that I read in 2019. I'd love to talk to you guys about any of the books on this list, whether or not you enjoyed them, and I'd also really appreciate it if you subscribed to this channel and signed up for notifications. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. This is also a YA fantasy. None of them were good.